You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Dutch architect Ton Venhoeven. We chat about his firm's TOD project in Utrecht, the 15-minute city and microcities, planning policy and its history in the Netherlands, and the future of cities. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. The fall is almost here, so get one to warm your transit-loving heart today. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of the Overhead Wire, including our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, Read Around the World. We pull the best news about cities from around the web and share them with readers each morning. It's the best newsletter in the business, so try us out for free by going to theoverheadwire.com. You'll also find links to buy the scarf as well as our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning in Practice. Go to theoverheadwire.com to find out more. Well, Ton Venhoeven, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Well, thanks for being here so early in the morning. It's midnight here. I believe it's like 8 a.m. there in the Netherlands.
It's 9. It's okay. It's doable.
It's doable. I wouldn't be awake at 9 a.m. But before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm an architect from the Netherlands, urban planner. I try to do both architecture and urbanism because I think that's really what this time needs to bridge the gap between architecture and urbanism. I have an office of 70 people and we work on a whole range of projects. I've been a professor in architectural history and theory, chief government advisor on infrastructure. I'm working for the World Bank and doing my projects.
And where are you in the Netherlands right now?
I'm in Amsterdam.
Cool. My parents lived in Rotterdam for a year. I came to visit in about 2000 or so. But yeah, so my first question is, how did you get into architecture? Like, what was the thing that spurred you to get interested in the topic?
Actually, I wanted to become an economist, and then I was hesitant a bit, and then I saw a design from a famous Dutch architect, Herman Hertzberger. And I was very enthusiastic about that, and then I knew I wanted to become an architect.
And that was it. You were in for life.
Yeah.
So what path, or like how did you get through your education? Did you decide then you were just going to go to school and become an architect, or did you become an apprentice somewhere, or how did that work?
I went to Delft University, and that's where I studied architecture. That's mainly how I did it. After graduating from Delft, I taught in Eindhoven and lots of other schools, and that's where I picked up also a lot of stuff.
Cool. So you've done a number of really great projects. I'm curious, like, which one is your favorite? What is one of your favorite projects that you've worked on in the last maybe 10 years or so?
That's very hard to say, but The one that is top of mind at the moment is the Aquatic Olympic Center in Paris that will be used in the 2024 Olympics. That's a very exciting project because it's not only a swimming pool with all kinds of options for swimming, for water polo, etc., but it's also an investment in the neighborhood of Saint-Denis. So it contributes to the revitalization of Saint-Denis. And that's the kind of projects that I really like.
How does that work? I mean, in terms of the revitalization, I mean, we hear a lot about Barcelona and what happened on the waterfront there. Obviously, we just had the Olympic Games in Tokyo, and because of the pandemic, it was a little bit hard to judge kind of the regeneration efforts. But I'm curious how that works when you're thinking about designing a place for, say, the Olympics. How does the surrounding neighborhood kind of come into play?
Well, there are different levels. One, of course, is the production of housing, because you need to house all these athletes. And then the houses will be used, the apartments will be used afterwards. Also, it's a huge investment in public space, in transportation, metro links, pedestrian bridge to connect the neighborhood to other neighborhoods that are better off. But also creating jobs, teaching young kids to swim, to make use of public space, to encounter each other, because a lot of people are afraid to let their children play outside, and also jobs here, but also jobs during the production, in the recycling of building materials, etc.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing when cities are talking about the Olympics and what the buildings are going to be like, and then in the discussion about the Los Angeles Olympics, they're talking about doing a lot of reuse of venues and things like that, and to keep the cost down, because I think folks are really getting frustrated, I think, by the costs of the Olympics and what their cities are having to pay. So the regeneration efforts, I think, are a major payback for the cities, but it's hard to sell, I think, going into the future of the Olympics in terms of how much money these cities are spending.
Yeah, I think there are two sides to this issue. One is cities have to invest heavily in infrastructure, in public space, etc. And under normal circumstances, it's hard to sell it to the public because it's tax money that is needed. The Olympics seems to be one of the few opportunities that cities have to make it a logical thing to sell to the public. Here, this project is particularly interesting because its structure of the Olympics in Paris was conceived in the same period as the climate agreements. So there is a strong influence from the climate agreements to the Olympics and vice versa, which means that, for example, all buildings will be existing buildings. There will be hardly any new buildings. This aquatic center is the only new building that is remaining. And the other buildings, of course, are the apartments. And then we had to comply with all kinds of requirements for the building. In terms of energy use, in terms of material use. It's at least 50% of the structure is made of wood. All these things, and also the social sustainability, the economic sustainability, all these aspects were part of the tender requirements. That made it very challenging, but also interesting from a design point of view.
That must be pretty exciting to be building the only new building for the Olympics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let's chat a little bit about the Tram and Bus Terminal adjacent to the Utrecht Central Station. How did this project come to be? Because in the United States, we talk a lot about transit-oriented development. This is something that I did and I worked on for a number of years. But I'm curious how this project came to be, where you're working on kind of a bus station housing hybrid.
What is interesting is that the citizens of Utrecht had been complaining for almost 50 years about this concrete monster of the station area. And it was a typical product of the 60s, with lots of concrete consumerism, with French fries and horrible smells, drug abuse, etc. And so when this whole renovation, revitalization of the station area started, everybody was very excited that, okay, this was a great opportunity to get rid of the highway of 300 meters or half a kilometer and turn it into a proper canal again. They were excited about improving walkability of the station area. And part of that was also, of course, that you have to think about public safety. You cannot have areas in the station area where there is no social activity, because that's where the nasty stuff happens. So a plan was made by urban planners with the city, redevelop this station area. And part of it was also a new tram line. We call it the tram line, but it's actually a metro line going to the University of Utrecht that connects to the station. That came in the place of very long and high frequent buses, because all the students, they arrive at the station, and from there they had to take the bus to go to the university. So when this whole development took place, the first idea was to cut proper streets through this concrete mass, and also build normal projects along those streets with very good connection to that public space. So here was a bus station. This was a bus station. And that was typically the backside of the station. Also, the arrival of the metro line was planned. And then everybody said, well, it's a difficult location, but we have to make a building here with apartments, with people. So we get the public activity here that is needed for this place. And then they wrote a tender with those requirements. So there was a clear brief about the zoning, about all the qualitative aspects of this project. And the financial bid was not very high. It was at least, it should be 3.5 million euros, because that's what was needed to build over the station. So I think in the end, our team bid like 4 million, 4.5 million or something, really a low price, because the most important for the city was to have citizens there and to have a good building there that would contribute to the quality of the station area.
And how did you negotiate with the transit agency? Because it is a bus and tram station next to the regional and national train system, but you're building apartments on top and you have green roof. You have all kinds of other important parts of the project. But how did you negotiate with the transit agency to develop it? Was it just that you decided to build a platform on top and then you built housing, or was there like a negotiation between figuring out how it all worked together?
Yeah, there was a long negotiation beforehand, before we won the tender. And the idea was already the company that built the metro line had already included this deck in their price. That was 3.5 million. So that's why the municipality wanted to have this 3.5 million. The idea was, because the metro line was under construction, we had a time frame, a window of opportunity to build the project, but it was necessary to build the deck before the metro would start running test drives. And then after that, there were all kinds of safety measures to take care that anything falling down would not fall on the metro.
That's probably a good thing to not have stuff falling on the metro.
Yeah.
There's 200 units in the project. Was there a public housing component or an affordable housing component to it?
It was so important for the city that they said we want to have affordable housing, so not social housing, which means 1,200 euros average price per month rent, which is quite affordable in the Netherlands. It's very attractive for people starting their careers.
Ecology was also important with all the green roof and the ability to have insects and the general kind of biodiversity involved. How did that pan out when you were trying to design the space?
Utrecht's one of the most forward-thinking cities in the Netherlands. They have very strong interest in creating a healthy city system. They want to get rid of private cars. They want to promote walking, cycling, and also biodiversity. This also is related, of course, to the heat stress aspects of station areas where you have a lot of concrete buildings, paved streets, etc. We wanted to include that, and we also did that. And what is important is that we took the advice from ecologists, because they explained to us how the habitat of this building, the biotop, is related to the biotopes of other places nearby. So then our landscape designer, he decided to use plants which are native and also which are a good place for bees to live, etc. And it was very interesting because after 1 month, we already had a beehive in the project. That was great. I really like it that this project is not one selling point. It has all these aspects which are necessary today: low energy consumption, optimal use of public transport, biodiversity included, etc., etc.
In your reading material, it talks about it as a microcity. And I guess that relates to the 15-minute city that people around the world seem to be having a discussion about at the moment. I'm curious, are those two terms interchangeable, or are they two different ideas?
They are very much related. The basic idea, if you say the basic idea is, can you have everything you want in 15 minutes walk, within 15 minutes walking, then it's related. If you think about, okay, how can we really make the services that are needed in contemporary cities with the people? I think the 15-minute city could do that, but it's lacking this social aspect of the microcity. The microcity is more like a neighborhood 2.0, where you also think about, if you consider that you have a multi-generational neighborhood, you have small kids, you have also people who are pensionados, people who are ill sometimes, and then they are healthy again. So you have this mix of people. It also creates the opportunity for people to organize themselves, for example, for food production or for energy production or for repair activities or lending stuff to other people. If you want to do that, you need to have a social structure, a social framework in your neighborhood. So the microcity, as I see it, is like a 15-minute walking entity, which connects to the larger urban area with hubs. So it would be a neighborhood where there is only very limited car traffic, and you basically walk towards your hub, and from there you take the train or the bus or you rent a car or whatever, creating that unity, that community in that neighborhood. That makes it possible for people to become local entrepreneurs in a collective way and thereby organize their own living and maybe produce their own stuff. They could own a 3D printing shop. They could teach each other how to deal in the digital culture. It's comparable to the 15-minute city, but I think it's more.
I like that. I like that it's more of a social structure than just kind of an infrastructure, because I think sometimes we get caught talking about the infrastructure in itself, and it's really the people that live there that make up the place. And it's hard to kind of separate the two, but we often do, at least here in the US, as planners. And right now we're talking about an infrastructure bill, and it's just talking about building stuff, building roads. And then we have to kind of remind people that there's a social infrastructure to it as well. I think that encompasses it quite nicely.
Yeah, I think it's very much related also to the walking aspect. I remember when I was in Los Angeles that people looked at us, Dutchmen, that we were walking. And they constantly warned us that it's unsafe to walk. But that is a chicken and egg issue. If you don't walk in the city, then the public space becomes unsafe. And so it's important to plan for a walkable city.
Well, if you come to San Francisco, we'll let you walk a little bit more than maybe
I
Los Angeles
know.
folks. But I enjoyed when I visited the Netherlands back in 2000. I enjoyed running and walking all around Rotterdam. It was really easy to get places, just by walking and running, which is what I was doing at the time. Even at 3 a.m., go for a run at 3 a.m. because I couldn't sleep. Obviously, the time change gets to you, so it's a wonderful place to be. I have a question about kind of the difficulty of the project. What was the hardest part of putting it all together?
The hardest part was not the design. That's rather, it's just a design assignment. It's technical. What was a problem is that there were two main issues. One is that the contracting company, the contractor, had the assignment for this deck. So the first 2 or 3 floors were built by that contractor. And then there were huge negotiations with our developer who wanted to make use of of the services of this contractor, but they couldn't fix the price. And so then they said goodbye to each other. And my developer founded his own contracting company. So that's an interesting model. And then that caused a delay, but also a different approach towards contracting, because this new contractor didn't buy everything in the beginning, but he bought the stuff along the way. And we came out of this financial crisis of 2008, 2012. What we experienced during that time was that the prices went up like crazy. And so we had to constantly cut budgets for pieces and redesign stuff to make it work. In the end, the developer suffered a loss. We also suffered a loss, but the city has a very nice project. So I'm happy with that.
I guess that would make anybody think twice about becoming their own contractor in the future.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's very strange because in that period, I think prices went up by 50% within 2 years. It's almost comparable now.
Yeah, we had. Yeah, I don't know if this is the same there, but here, during the kind of the height of the pandemic, wood prices, for example, lumber prices went up, skyrocketed, and so
Right.
it was kind of crazy seeing how much people were paying for wood.
Yeah.
And it's gone down since then, but it was kind of insane. But I can see where if you started a project kind of at the beginning of the pandemic and you were working on it through there, you might have been pulling your hair out because of the costs.
Yeah. And it's the same now. I mean, you start a project and along the way, it's going 50% over budget. And it also means that you constantly have to rethink your decisions. Luckily, the revenues also go up. But yeah.
And this is something, I mean, the station and the transit-oriented development, the station area redevelopment, this is something that the Dutch government is kind of encouraging around the country. Is this something that they've been focusing more on in recent years, or is it something that they've always kind of thought about, but maybe they're doing a little bit more case study work on it these days?
I think that in the past, we had a very strong transit-oriented development strategy. Let's say Dutch cities are cycling cities with a station. But that's until the Second World War. After the Second World War, there was a big focus on building new suburbs and based on the private car. And in the Netherlands, also bus systems. So gradually, these stations in the city centers, the stations that were built at the end of the 19th century on the side of the cities, were gradually in the city center, but where people lived was much further away. So the interest in the stations and station areas started, let's say, in the 90s, with a huge success in France of the high-speed trains. So it was decided that the high-speed train would come to the Netherlands as well, to Amsterdam. And now we also have a connection with the high-speed train to London, and people are talking about a high-speed train to Berlin. So that caused the first new wave of station redevelopment, with 5 major train stations, of which Utrecht, Rotterdam, Amsterdam are important examples. After people rediscover this station and rediscover that it's actually extremely comfortable to take the train to Rotterdam. It's only 20-25 minutes, whereas you take your car, it's 1.5 hours. That means that there is also the cities decided to focus on inner city redevelopment, densification, and stop with building up meadows. Try to transform the agriculture into more circular agriculture, better for biodiversity, less CO2 emissions. The whole process is now full speed. And we're also working on station areas of provincial cities, provincial towns with only like 100,000 inhabitants. But because they are connected to Amsterdam, you cannot go to Amsterdam by car anymore. because there's nowhere to park. So you better take the train from Alkmaar. That's an example where I'm working on. So these station areas, they follow suit.
That's really interesting. Is the stationary planning for those smaller cities and towns, is that similar to what you would do in a larger city, or are they separate based on kind of the size of the place?
Yeah, of course, it differs a lot per city. Most cities, like Amsterdam, has to build like 400,000 apartments in the next 20 years, and that's not possible within the municipality. So 200,000 is the max, and that means that a lot of people, they are depending on these smaller cities. And actually, when you talk about Amsterdam, you should talk about the metropolitan area, because within 1 hour travel, you find like 10 million people. And the Amsterdam metropolitan area is one, and the Rotterdam metropolitan area is the other. The Randstad, altogether, the city of Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Utrecht, and Eindhoven, together, that's 10 million people. And I think you can travel easily within at least 1.5 hours, maximum 1.5 hours, but most of it is you can travel within 1 hour. So people tend to live in small communities or provincial towns and still be part of this metropolitan area. So how to organize that traffic in the most optimal way, that's an important challenge. But the other challenge is how to make a lot of apartments in those provincial towns, in the city centers next to the station. So that's where we try to also develop economic activities. So people from you don't have full trains from Alkmaar to the city of Amsterdam, but also full trains in the opposite direction. So that's why we work also for the National Rail, not for the city of Alkmaar. And the National Rail is working together with the city of Alkmaar. But they are the main driver behind this development.
And that relates to kind of the idea of mobility hubs generally. I mean, those stations act as a center for the city, and people have to get to and from there without their automobile. Many people don't have automobiles. Can you kind of describe that process too, of thinking about mobility hubs and thinking about what those station areas could be and how people can get around with a new paradigm?
What we try to do is to minimize car use, at least private car use. So we work on those station areas as 15-minute cities. So we try to organize the functions in that area in such a way that you can find everything you need within 15 minutes walking. Even though you have a train, but the train is actually, and the bus system is a backup for walking. So the main idea is that people do everything walking, and they don't have to walk a lot, so they can enjoy what they want to do instead of being forced to travel. So that's the 15 minutes. So we think about how can we improve existing streets, how can we remove parked cars, how can we introduce green in those areas, and how can we add lots of new housing, economic spaces. How can we make use of the education institutes that are there? But also, how can we provide parking spaces for cyclists? Because what you see now is more and more people tend to take the electric bike to commute, because if they live in small villages next to Alkmaar, they also use this train station, but they take the electric bike to the train station, and from there they take the train to Amsterdam. So that's also an interesting feature. So the 15-minute city principle is very important. And then, of course, you start to work on your checklist. What is it that is needed for the city of the future? And you start with energy, infrastructure for traveling, the bus system, the car sharing systems, the pods, the whatever, everything that you talk about, we also talk about it. And the National Rail has a very strong program to introduce that in their park and ride facilities. So the park and ride facility is also part of the station, because the provincial towns tend to have more of a car culture, because they're not used to a very advanced public transport system. If you live in a village, there is no high frequent metro. So people take the bicycle or they take the car and go to the station, park their car, and then take the train to Amsterdam. So organizing this system and making use of it in economic development and also for the 15-minute city, that's the main challenge.
You were the chief government advisor on infrastructure for the Dutch government for a while. I'm curious how you make this policy. Like how does the government write the policy so that everybody will follow those plans to make the station areas the places where they need to develop, the transport operating the way it's supposed to? How does the policy work so that everybody in different cities enacts a similar process and policy? Is there like a planning document for the country? How does that work specifically? I've always been curious.
We used to have, especially after the Second World War, we had a very strong planning system because of the need for lots of houses. The housing sector was extremely powerful. So planning of new neighborhoods, the planning of apartment buildings, etc., everything was organized on a national level with subsidies and deadlines for the subsidies. So if you didn't follow the rules, you didn't get money, things like that. But from the 70s, on the oil crisis and neoliberalism by Thatcher and Reagan, big government was seen as a bad thing and against economic development. So a lot of the powers were taken away from the ministry for planning. Also in the cities, the right-wing liberal politicians, like how can I compare them? Let's say conservative liberal. Liberal in a sense that free market conservatism.
I guess we'd call that like libertarian here. Is like
libertarian? Yeah. It's not as extreme as in the States, but
right.
Here also at the municipal level, a lot of power was taken away from urban planners. And now you see that there is a trend that people acknowledge that only urban planning can solve a lot of the issues. We regain some power. We're even talking at the national level about creating a new ministry for planning. It would be a revolution if that happens.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So what happened is that during my time, spatial planning was part of different ministries. In one period, it was part of the environmental ministry. In another, it was part of the infrastructure ministry. But it was not even allowed to mention planning as a name. It was not allowed to mention that. So what we did was, let's say, prepare for the future. If you cannot influence the policy of next year or the year after that or the year after that, you just think ahead. Okay, let's come up with solutions that we know we need in the coming 20 years. So when I left as government advisor, I wrote a book as a legacy about multimodal node development. And that's the first time that I really wrote down about the hubs. Because there was such a strong tendency to support the car and subsidize the car, it was only allowed to talk about multimodal access. And so not modal shift, but multimodal access. So that's what I used most within the ministry to get the minds of car believers to shift to acknowledging that also in certain areas, public transport was very important.
You're thinking on the future of cities. I know that you helped put together a piece thinking about 2050 and the future. For me, when I was reading through it, I think one of the things that I really liked was it was focused on a number of different items: climate change, resource depletion, loss of biodiversity, pollution, all of these issues that we think are really important in this era of thinking about climate change. But it was kind of refreshing to think about the whole system rather than just the planning or just the transportation aspect. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the future of the city and looking forward to 2050.
I think we cannot afford to first solve the transportation crisis and then solve the energy crisis and then solve the biodiversity crisis. Then it's 2100, and everything is lost. That's one. The other is that a lot of these systems are so interdependent that if you only talk about change in infrastructure, there are just too many lock-ins. So it's fully related with the economic system we have. If you think about biodiversity loss in the Netherlands, we are the second agricultural producer in the world. And we are that because we import the soybeans that our cattle needs. And for that, the Amazon is cut down. So everything is related. So we really need a big systems change. I think it's the task of urban planners, not on a daily basis. But if you are asked, can you help? And we were asked by the ministries, by some couple of ministries and the 5 big cities in the Netherlands, can you help us to visualize what is needed for the future of our cities? So then we went all out. I felt like people must have felt who were working at Bauhaus in the 20th century, or in the Russian constructivist. I studied a lot of those historical movements.
CIAM, that one too.
Yeah, exactly. So what you see is that people in those ages, they looked at the whole system and they designed the new culture. And I was taught by other people, or other people told me, culture is something you cannot change. It's just like that, and it goes on, and your design should fit into that culture. No. Culture is designed. Every 100 years, we make a radical shift because the systems don't work anymore. And that's where you can see also this challenge.
Yeah, and it was interesting looking at, you looked back at CIAM, you looked back at Le Corbusier, some of the, the ideas of the past, and obviously they weren't quite right, and they didn't quite work out the way that maybe they wanted them to be. What did you learn from looking back on that history that you take forward with you?
I think they were extremely successful when you look at their aim. The aim was to use mechanization and serial production to create prosperity for all. And if you compare the prosperity now, today, or let's say 20 years ago, to the prosperity of the end of the 19th century, they made a huge leap in creating this prosperity. But if you look at what they didn't see, is all the biodiversity loss and the huge inequalities between the super rich and extremely poor, contemporary slavery, because we have this globalized system that nobody controls. Those are things that you cannot judge them. You can only judge yourself if you, without being critical, just follow the same path and go on business as usual. We are responsible for changing our way of doing things.
We have so much more knowledge now. You're right. I mean, we know how things work, how things are interconnected. I mean, current systems in the ocean, we wouldn't have really known, it takes a long time to study those things and research to know that what's going on with the oceans and how that's impacting climate change, how much CO2 they can absorb. I mean, nobody really knew back then those types of issues. So I guess we have to be mindful of the things that we can be mindful of. And then in the future, there's probably something we're forgetting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we are probably also making mistakes, but don't worry too much about it, because there are other people in the future that will deal with that. Yeah,
I guess that could be two ways. We're pushing them to make those decisions as well, making their lives harder maybe. Well, so where can folks find your work if they want to take a look at some of your projects, at some of the really cool stuff that you all have done, some of your writing? Where can folks go to find your work?
Yeah, go to my website.
You have the URL. I guess I can post. I'll post the URL in the show notes so folks can check it out. Well, Ton, we thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a nice conversation.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.